The warm spring sun shone down on Liberty Park as Staff Sergeant James Cooper walked along the tree-lined path. He was still wearing his army fatigues, having just finished a long training session at Fort Hamilton Military Base where he worked as a combat instructor. His boots made soft sounds on the concrete path as he looked for his favorite spot, an old wooden bench under a large oak tree that gave him the perfect view of both the playground and the small lake. At 32 years old, James had already seen more action than most soldiers. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent too many days under the harsh Afghan sun during his 3 tours of duty. Though he wasn't a large man, standing at 5 feet 10 inches, his body was lean and strong from years of military training. A small scar above his right eyebrow told the story of a close call with an IED that had earned him a Purple Heart. As he settled onto his usual bench, James pulled out a worn paperback book from his backpack. It was The Old Man and the Sea, a story he'd read many times before. Reading helped him relax and forget about the memories that sometimes kept him awake at night. The park had become his sanctuary over the past year since he'd started working at the base. Around him, the park was alive with the sounds of a typical Sunday afternoon. Children laughed and screamed with joy on the playground, where parents watched from nearby benches. An elderly couple walked their small white dog along the lake's edge, stopping occasionally to throw bread to the eager ducks. A group of teenagers played basketball on the court, their shouts and the sound of the bouncing ball carrying across the grass. James smiled as he watched a young father teaching his daughter how to ride a bike without training wheels. The little girl, probably around 6 years old, wore a pink helmet and had determination written all over her face. It reminded him of his own childhood in Kansas, where his dad had taught him the same thing in their long driveway. The smell of barbecue drifted over from the picnic area, where several families were enjoying late lunch cookouts. A pair of squirrels chased each other up and down the oak tree above his head, sending a few acorns dropping onto the grass. The peaceful scene was exactly why James loved coming here after his training sessions. Opening his book, James found his bookmark, an old photograph of his unit from his last deployment. The faces of his fellow soldiers smiled back at him, bringing both happy and painful memories. 3 of the men in that photo hadn't made it home. That's why he'd chosen to become an instructor after his last tour, to make sure other soldiers had the best possible training before heading into combat. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming flowers from the park's small garden. James took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. After spending so much time in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, he never took these simple pleasures for granted anymore. He had just started reading when Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who often walked in the park, stopped to say hello. She lived in the apartment building across the street and always had a kind word for everyone she met. Today she'd have brought him a small bag of homemade cookies, just as she did every Sunday. "You work too hard, young man," she said with a grandmother's concern in her voice. "Make sure you eat these while they're still warm." James thanked her with a genuine smile, knowing that these small acts of kindness were what made this community feel like home. As Mrs. Thompson continued her walk, James opened the bag of cookies, the smell of chocolate chips and vanilla making his stomach rumble. He hadn't realized how hungry he was after the morning's training session. Taking a bite of the still warm cookie, he returned to his book, feeling completely at peace in his favorite spot. Little did he know that this peaceful Sunday afternoon was about to change dramatically. The sound of approaching motorcycles was still too distant to hear, but soon the tranquility of Liberty Park would be shattered, and James Cooper would find himself facing a situation that would call upon all of his military training, not on a battlefield, but in a place where families came to find peace. The peaceful atmosphere of Liberty Park shattered like glass when the deep rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. James Cooper looked up from his book as 5 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their engines unnecessarily loud. The riders weren't ordinary bikers out for a Sunday ride. These men belonged to the Night Wolves, a local gang known for causing trouble in the area. The group's leader, a tall man with a shaved head covered in tribal tattoos who went by the name Snake, cut his engine first. His black leather vest displayed the gang's symbol, a snarling wolf with red eyes. The other 4 bikers followed his lead, parking their motorcycles in a way that blocked 2 family cars trying to leave the lot. Parents quickly gathered their children from the playground, hurrying them away from the approaching bikers. The teenage basketball players grabbed their things and left the court, while the elderly couple with their dog rushed toward the park exit. The sudden change in atmosphere was like watching storm clouds roll in over a sunny day. James watched as the bikers swaggered into the park, carrying beer cans despite the clear no alcohol signs posted everywhere. They were loud, cursing and laughing as they knocked over a trash can. Snake took a long drink from his beer, crushing the can and throwing it toward the lake, deliberately missing the nearby garbage bin. Two of the bikers, both wearing dirty denim vests covered in patches, started harassing a group of college students who were packing up their picnic. The students quickly gathered their belongings, leaving behind their half-eaten food as they hurried away. The bikers laughed, helping themselves to the abandoned chips and sandwiches. "Hey, look what we got here!" Another biker called out. This one wore a red bandana and had a long gray beard. He pointed toward the playground where a young mother was trying to leave with her two small children. She had a little boy around 4 and a girl who couldn't be more than 6. The woman was struggling to carry her daughter while holding her son's hand, moving as quickly as she could toward the parking lot. James felt his muscles tense as he watched the scene unfold. He'd seen that same look of fear on civilians' faces in war zones, people who just wanted to live their lives in peace or were being terrorized by those who enjoyed causing fear. His hand unconsciously touched the scar above his eyebrow as memories from Afghanistan flickered through his mind. Snake and 2 others approached the young mother, blocking her path to the parking lot. "What's your hurry, pretty lady?" Snake called out, his voice carrying across the now quiet park. "Why don't you stay and have some fun with us?" The woman pulled her children closer, her face pale with fear as she tried to step around them. The few remaining people in the park were either quickly leaving or watching from a safe distance, many with phones in their hands. Some were probably calling the police, but James knew that even if someone had called, it would take at least 10 minutes for officers to arrive. A lot could happen in 10 minutes. Mrs. Thompson, who had given James the cookies earlier, was still in the park. She stood near the garden, clutching her walking cane tightly as she watched the scene with worried eyes. One of the bikers noticed her and made a mock-scary face, causing his friends to laugh when she flinched. The young mother's son started crying, which only seemed to amuse the bikers more. "Ah, look at that," Snake mocked, taking a step closer to them. "Maybe the kid needs a new daddy to toughen him up." His friends laughed again, creating a circle around the frightened family. James closed his book slowly, his combat-trained mind already assessing the situation. 5 opponents, all bigger than him, but likely untrained. 2 were already showing signs of being drunk. The woman and her children were the immediate priority. They needed a clear path to escape. He noticed Snake had a chain hanging from his belt loop, and another biker had brass knuckles in his back pocket. They were looking for trouble, and they were about to find it. Standing up from his bench, James knew this wasn't his war zone anymore, but some things were worth fighting for no matter where you were. The cookies Mrs. Thompson had given him sat forgotten on the bench as he stepped forward, his military training kicking in with each measured step. The peace of Liberty Park had been broken, and now it was time to restore it. James Cooper walked calmly toward the group of bikers, his combat boots making soft sounds on the park's concrete path. Years of military training had taught him to stay calm in dangerous situations. And right now, his steady heartbeat and clear mind told him he was in full control. "Excuse me," James said in a firm, clear voice. "The lady and her children would like to leave." His words carried across the now quiet park. Snake and his gang turned to look at the soldier, surprise showing on their faces. They clearly weren't used to anyone standing up to them. Well, what do we have here?" Snake sneered, turning away from the frightened mother. He walked toward James, trying to use his height advantage to look intimidating. "Looks like G.I. Joe wants to play hero." The other bikers laughed, spreading out to form a loose circle around James. The young mother saw her chance. While the bikers were distracted, she quickly moved away with her children, hurrying toward the parking lot. James noticed this from the corner of his eye but kept his attention focused on Snake, who was now only a few feet away from him. "Look, buddy," James said calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides. "This is a family park. There are signs clearly stating no alcohol is allowed. Why don't you and your friends head somewhere else?" He spoke in the same steady tone he used when training new recruits, showing neither fear nor aggression. Snake took another step closer, the smell of beer strong on his breath. "And who's going to make us leave?" "You." He looked James up and down, clearly unimpressed by the soldier's lean build. There's 5 of us and 1 of you, military boy. The biker with the gray beard and red bandana moved behind James, while the other 3 spread out to his sides. James didn't turn his head, but his peripheral vision, sharpened by years of combat situations, tracked every movement. He noticed the one on his left was favoring his right foot, probably from an old injury. The 2 on his right were standing too close together, which would slow their reaction time. I'm giving you a chance to leave peacefully, James replied, still keeping his voice calm. That's more than you gave those families. He noticed Mrs. Thompson had managed to reach a park bench near the exit. She was on her phone, probably calling the police. Good, but help would still take time to arrive. Snake's face darkened with anger. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not with such calm confidence. Boys, he called out to his gang, looks like this soldier boy needs to learn some respect. He reached for the chain hanging from his belt loop. James remained still, his military training taking over. His mind flashed back to his hand-to-hand combat instructor's words. Stay calm, assess your surroundings, use your opponent's aggression against them. He could hear the rustle of movement behind him as the biker with the gray beard stepped closer. Last chance, James offered, knowing they wouldn't take it. Some situations couldn't be resolved peacefully, no matter how much you tried. He'd learned that in Afghanistan, and it seemed the same lesson applied here in Liberty Park. Snake's response was predictable. He swung the chain toward James's head in a wide arc, expecting an easy victory. But James wasn't there anymore. With the smooth movement of a trained fighter, he stepped inside Snake's swing, using the biker's own momentum against him. The chain whistled harmlessly through the air where James had been standing a split second before. Snake's eyes widened in surprise as he realized his attack had missed completely. The other bikers started moving in, but they were already too late. James knew the next few seconds would determine everything. He had positioned himself perfectly. Snake was now between him and the biker with brass knuckles, preventing them from attacking together. The 2 bikers who had been standing too close were stumbling over each other trying to spread out. Time seemed to slow down, just like it did in combat. James could hear children crying in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the trees, and the heavy breathing of the bikers around him. His muscles tensed, ready for what was coming. The peaceful afternoon at Liberty Park had turned into something very different, and James Cooper was about to show these bikers exactly why you don't mess with a Special Forces soldier. Everything happened fast after Snake's failed chain attack. The biker with the gray beard rushed at James from behind, thinking he had the element of surprise. James heard the heavy footsteps and reacted without looking. Years of combat training had taught his body to move without thinking. In one smooth motion, James stepped to the side and grabbed the charging biker's vest, using the man's own speed against him. With a quick twist and pull, he sent the bearded biker crashing into Snake. Both men stumbled, tangling themselves in Snake's chain as they tried to keep their balance. Get him! Snake shouted, his face red with anger and embarrassment. The biker with brass knuckles charged forward, throwing a wild punch at James's head. James blocked it easily with his forearm, the same way he taught hundreds of soldiers in hand-to-hand combat training. Before the biker could pull his arm back, James grabbed his wrist and twisted. The brass knuckles fell from the man's fingers as he yelped in pain. James wasn't trying to hurt anyone badly, just neutralize the threat. He pushed the biker away, sending him stumbling backward into a park bench. The 2 remaining bikers attacked together, coming at James from both sides. One had a knife, which glinted in the afternoon sun. James's military training kicked in even stronger. A knife made things more serious, but he dealt with armed opponents before. Drop the knife, James warned, his voice still calm despite the situation. The biker responded by slashing wildly at him. James moved like water, flowing away from the blade while staying just close enough to remain a threat. The other biker tried to grab him from behind, but James was ready. He dropped his shoulder and used the grabbing biker's momentum to flip him over. The man landed hard on his back, the air rushing from his lungs with a loud oomph. The knife-wielding biker hesitated, surprised by how easily his friend had been taken down. Snake had untangled himself from his fallen friend and was now circling James, the chain wrapped around his fist. You're dead, soldier boy, he growled, but James could hear the uncertainty in his voice. This wasn't going the way Snake had planned. James kept his stance loose but ready, just like he'd been taught in Special Forces training. His eyes tracked every movement, his breath steady and controlled. He wasn't even sweating yet. "We can still end this peacefully," he offered, knowing what the answer would be. Snake and the knife-wielding biker charged at the same time. James waited until the last possible moment before moving. He grabbed Snake's chain-wrapped fist and pulled, causing Snake to stumble forward. At the same time, he kicked out at the other biker's knee, not hard enough to break it but enough to make him fall. The knife clattered to the ground as the biker fell. James kicked it away, sending it sliding under a nearby bush. Snake tried to punch with his free hand, but James blocked it and twisted the chain-wrapped fist, forcing Snake to his knees. "Stay down," James commanded, using his drill instructor voice. Snake struggled for a moment, then went still as James applied slightly more pressure to his twisted arm. The other bikers were slowly getting to their feet, but none of them seemed eager to attack again. In the distance, police sirens could finally be heard approaching. Several park visitors had recorded the entire fight on their phones. Mrs. Thompson was clapping from her bench near the exit, and a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance to watch. James looked at the bikers, who were now all standing together, looking much less confident than they had minutes ago. None of them were seriously hurt, just bruised bodies and damaged pride. Snake was rubbing his wrist where the chain had dug into his skin. "The police will be here soon," James said calmly. "I suggest you leave the park and don't come back, and if I ever hear about you harassing families here again." He left the threat unfinished, but his meaning was clear. The bikers looked at each other, then at Snake. Their leader's face was a mix of anger and embarrassment, but he knew they had been beaten. Without a word, he turned and started walking toward the parking lot. The others followed quickly, leaving behind the brass knuckles and knife. James watched them go, his body still ready for action if needed. But he knew the fight was over. In less than 5 minutes, he had shown 5 troublemakers exactly why it was a bad idea to mess with someone who had spent years training for combat. More importantly, he had protected the families who came to Liberty Park for peace and quiet. As the sound of motorcycle engines faded into the distance, James Cooper took a deep breath and looked around Liberty Park. The peaceful Sunday afternoon had been disrupted, but at least no one was hurt. People began emerging from their hiding spots, many with phones still recording. The young mother he had helped protect came running back to the park, her children safely waiting in her car. Tears were streaming down her face as she approached James. Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I was so scared." "Those men?" "They were." She couldn't finish her sentence. "It's okay now, ma'am," James replied gently. "Are your children all right?" He remembered the little boys crying and hoped the kids hadn't been too frightened by what happened. As a soldier, he had seen how violence could affect young minds. "They're fine, thanks to you." She smiled through her tears. "I'm Sarah Williams, and I bring my kids here every weekend. I've never seen those men before." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Are you really a soldier?" Before James could answer, Mrs. Thompson arrived with her walking cane in one hand and his forgotten book in the other. "Of course he is, dear," she said proudly. "Staff Sergeant James Cooper. He's been protecting our park for months now, but this is the first time he's had to do it quite so dramatically." More people gathered around James. The teenagers who had been playing basketball earlier came back, looking at him with newfound respect. "That was amazing," one of them exclaimed. "The way you flipped that big guy, it was like something from an action movie." James felt slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. In Afghanistan, he had done his job quietly, never seeking recognition. "I just did what needed to be done," he said simply. "Nobody should feel afraid in a public park." 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing. Officer Martinez, who regularly patrolled the area, stepped out and walked over to the group. "I got multiple calls about a disturbance," he said, taking out his notebook. "Something about bikers causing trouble." Several people started talking at once, describing what had happened. Mrs. Thompson spoke the loudest, waving her cane for emphasis as she told the officer how James had protected everyone. Sarah added her story about how the bikers had threatened her and her children. Officer Martinez looked at James with respect. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, right? I've seen you reading in the park before." He wrote some notes in his pad. "Did you get a good look at these men? Any identifying marks or details about their motorcycles?" James described the bikers in detail, including their gang symbols and the license plate numbers he had memorized, a habit from his military training. The officer seemed impressed by his clear, precise report. "We've had trouble with the night wolves before," Officer Martinez said, finishing his notes. "This will help us track them down, though after the lesson you taught them today, I doubt they'll be causing problems here again." A small boy tugged at James's pant leg. It was Sarah's son, who must have slipped away from the car. "Are you a superhero?" he asked innocently, looking up at James with wide eyes. The adults around them laughed, breaking the tension that still lingered in the air. James knelt down to the boy's level, smiling gently. "No, buddy, I'm just a soldier who believes in protecting people." The boy nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to him. As the crowd began to disperse and normal park activities resumed, James noticed something interesting. Instead of leaving, families were setting their picnic blankets back out. The basketball players returned to their game. An elderly couple even brought their dogs back for a walk. Mrs. Thompson patted James's arm. "You've done more than just stop some troublemakers today," she said wisely. "You've shown everyone that they don't have to be afraid, that there are still good people who will stand up to bullies." James picked up his book from where Mrs. Thompson had placed it on the bench. The cookies she had given him earlier were still there, somehow undisturbed by all the excitement. He took one and bit into it, enjoying the sweetness as he watched peace return to Liberty Park. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. In a strange way, the park felt even more peaceful now than it had before the bikers arrived. Sometimes, James realized, you had to face a little trouble to appreciate the quiet moments even more. By Monday morning, videos of James Cooper's encounter with the bikers had spread across social media like wildfire. Someone had posted the footage with the title "Brave Soldier Takes Down 5 Bikers to Protect Families in Park," and it quickly went viral. James discovered this when he arrived at Fort Hamilton for his morning training session. The young recruits he was supposed to be teaching were all watching the video on their phones. They snapped to attention when he walked into the training area, but their eyes were full of newfound admiration. "At ease?" James said, trying to act like it was just another normal day. But Private Jenkins couldn't contain himself. "Sir, is it true you took down 5 armed bikers yesterday? We saw the video, but that was really you, wasn't it?" Before James could answer, Colonel Richardson walked into the training area. The colonel was a tall, serious man who rarely smiled, but today there was a hint of amusement on his face. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, a word in my office, please." As James followed the colonel, he could hear the recruits whispering excitedly behind him. The walk to the colonel's office felt longer than usual. Inside, Colonel Richardson closed the door and sat behind his desk. "So, Cooper," the colonel began, turning his computer monitor around. On the screen was the viral video, showing James efficiently dealing with the bikers. "It seems you had an eventful Sunday afternoon." "Yes, sir," James replied, standing at attention. "I apologize if my actions have caused any problems for the base." He wasn't sure if he was in trouble or not. Military rules about engaging with civilians could be strict. To his surprise, Colonel Richardson laughed. "Problems? Cooper, you've just given us the best recruitment advertising we could ask for. The video shows exactly what we train our soldiers to be: skilled, controlled, and willing to protect civilians." The colonel stood up and walked around his desk. "The mayor called this morning. She wants to give you a civilian service award. The local news stations are asking for interviews. Even the governor tweeted about it." James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all due respect, I wasn't looking for attention. I just wanted to help that family and restore peace to the park." "And that's exactly why you deserve the recognition," Colonel Richardson said firmly. "You showed remarkable restraint. No one was seriously injured, you protected civilians, and you demonstrated everything we teach about controlled force." The colonel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. "The police just called. They've arrested 3 members of the Night Wolves gang based on your descriptions. Turns out they were wanted for other crimes too. You didn't just protect the park, Cooper, you helped clean up the whole neighborhood." Back in the training area, James found his students eager to learn. They paid more attention than ever as he demonstrated hand-to-hand combat techniques. "Remember," he told them, "fighting should always be the last resort. Your first duty is to protect, not to harm." During lunch break, James checked his phone and found dozens of messages. Sarah Williams, the mother from the park, had somehow found him on social media. She sent a picture her son had drawn in school. A stick figure in army clothes, standing in front of a family, with the words "My Hero" written in crayon. Mrs. Thompson called to tell him that the park was busier than ever. People felt safe there now, knowing that good people would stand up against troublemakers. She also mentioned that her church group was organizing a thank you breakfast for him on Saturday. Even local businesses were reacting to the incident. The coffee shop near the park put up a sign offering free coffee to all military personnel. The owner told everyone how James had been quietly reading there every Sunday for months, never bringing attention to himself. By the end of the day, James felt overwhelmed by all the attention. As he drove home, he passed by Liberty Park and decided to stop. The evening was peaceful, with families enjoying the late sunshine. A group of children played soccer where the fight had happened just yesterday. Sitting on his usual bench, James pulled out his book. An old couple walking by smiled and waved at him. A little girl offered him a dandelion she had picked. James accepted it with a smile, tucking it between the pages of his book as a bookmark. This wasn't the kind of recognition he had ever sought, but looking around at the happy, safe families in the park, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, he realized, the most important battles weren't fought in far-off lands, but right here at home. A week after the incident at Liberty Park, James Cooper was having coffee at his usual cafe when a surprising visitor walked in. It was Snake, the leader of the bikers, but he looked very different now. Gone was the threatening appearance. He wore regular clothes, and his face showed signs of someone who hadn't slept well for days. James watched carefully as Snake approached his table. The cafe owner, Mr. Rodriguez, moved closer to the counter where he kept a baseball bat, but James gave him a small nod indicating everything was okay. "Mind if I sit?" Snake asked quietly, his voice lacking its previous arrogance. When James gestured to the empty chair, Snake sat down, looking uncomfortable. For a moment, neither man spoke. "I'm not here for trouble," Snake finally said, staring into the empty space between them. I came to apologize." He rubbed his face with his hands, showing faded bruises from their encounter. James remained silent, giving the man time to speak. His military training had taught him that sometimes the hardest battles were fought with words, not fists. "My real name's Thomas," Snake continued. "I saw the video of what happened. My daughter saw it too." He pulled out his phone and showed James a picture of a young girl, maybe 12 years old. "She lives with her mom. When she saw what I was doing in that park, she called me crying." James nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. Sometimes it took a hard fall to make someone see their mistakes. "Those families in the park," Thomas went on, his voice breaking slightly, "they could have been my daughter and her mom. I've been thinking about that all week. Haven't slept much." He looked directly at James for the first time. "You could have really hurt us that day, but you didn't." "That wasn't the point," James replied calmly. "The point was to protect people, not to cause harm." Mr. Rodriguez brought over 2 fresh cups of coffee, refusing payment from either man. The cafe was quiet except for the soft music playing in the background. "I left the gang," Thomas said after taking a sip. 3 of our guys got arrested. The others? Well, they're laying low, but I'm done with all that. My daughter asked if she could visit me next month, and I want to be someone she can be proud of." James listened as Thomas explained how the fight in the park had changed him. He'd spent the past week thinking about his life, about the kind of man he'd become. He even started looking for honest work, though his record made it difficult. "I know a few people who work with veterans outreach programs," James said thoughtfully. "They also help others who want to turn their lives around. Would you be interested in talking to them?" Thomas's eyes lit up with hope. "You do that, even after what happened?" "Everyone deserves a second chance," James replied, thinking of soldiers he'd known who had found their way back from dark places. "The hard part is choosing to take it." They talked for another hour. Thomas shared stories about his daughter, his eyes softening when he spoke about her. James told him about programs that could help him find work and rebuild his life. By the time they finished their coffee, something had changed between them. As Thomas stood to leave, he reached out his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for today, but for that day in the park too. You did more than stop a fight. You stopped me from destroying my life. James shook his hand firmly. Keep moving forward, he advised. Your daughter will be proud to see her father choosing a better path. After Thomas left, Mr. Rodriguez came over with another coffee for James. You know, the cafe owner said with a smile, in my country, we have a saying, sometimes your worst enemy becomes your best teacher. James watched through the window as Thomas walked away, his shoulders straighter than when he'd arrived. In the park across the street, families were enjoying the sunny day without fear. Children played on the swings where just a week ago there had been chaos. Mrs. Thompson, who had witnessed the entire conversation from her regular table, came over to James. You didn't just save the park that day, she said softly. It looks like you might have saved a soul too. James smiled, thinking about how life could change in unexpected ways. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't won through force, but through understanding and compassion. As he sipped his coffee, he realized that this might be the most important result of that Sunday afternoon fight, not the viral video or the public praise, but this quiet moment of transformation in a small cafe. 1 month had passed since the incident at Liberty Park, and the place had changed in wonderful ways. On this particular Sunday afternoon, James Cooper sat on his usual bench, but the scene before him was different from anything he could have imagined. The park was hosting its first Community Unity Day, an event inspired by what had happened that fateful Sunday. Families filled every corner of the park, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with music from a small local band playing near the lake. James watched as Sarah Williams and her children helped Mrs. Thompson set up tables for the community picnic. Her little boy, Tommy, now wore a toy soldier's helmet, and his sister had drawn pictures of her park hero for the community bulletin board. Near the basketball court, something even more surprising was happening. Thomas, the former snake, was teaching teenagers how to fix bikes at a free repair workshop. He found work at a local motorcycle repair shop through the Veterans Outreach Program, and now he was giving back to the community. His daughter sat nearby, watching her father with proud eyes. Officer Martinez had brought his K9 unit for a police dog demonstration, showing children how the trained dogs help keep the community safe. The message was clear. There were many ways to protect people, and violence didn't have to be the answer. The local coffee shop owner, Mr. Rodriguez, had set up a free beverage station. Every time James tried to pay for a coffee, Mr. Rodriguez would shake his head and point to the small sign that read, "Forever free for our park hero." Colonel Richardson arrived with a group of young recruits who had volunteered to help with the event. They were setting up games for children and sharing stories about what it meant to serve their country. James noticed how they emphasized protection and service over combat. Staff Sergeant Cooper, a familiar voice, called. James turned to see Mayor Thompson walking toward him. She had been instrumental in organizing this event. Would you mind saying a few words to everyone? The community would love to hear from you. James usually avoided public speaking, but today felt different. He walked to the small podium they had set up near the playground, where families gathered to listen. Looking out at the crowd, he saw faces that had once shown fear now filled with joy and peace. A month ago, James began, keeping his words simple and clear. Something happened in this park that could have divided our community. Instead, it brought us together. He paused, looking at the diverse crowd before him. I see more than just families enjoying a Sunday afternoon, he continued. I see Mr. Thomas teaching young people valuable skills. Thomas nodded from his repair station, his daughter beaming beside him. I see Officer Martinez showing us how to protect through understanding, not fear. I see Mrs. Thompson and Sarah bringing people together with food and friendship. The crowd listened quietly as James spoke. Even the children seemed to understand the importance of his words. What makes a community strong isn't the absence of problems, James said, remembering his military training. It's how we come together to solve those problems. Every one of you is a hero in your own way, making this park and this community a better place. After his speech, people came up to share their stories. A teenage boy told James how he'd been inspired to join a conflict resolution program at school. A young mother mentioned how she felt safe bringing her children to the park again. As the sun began to set, families spread blankets on the grass for an outdoor movie. The screen had been set up where the fight had taken place, transforming a spot of conflict into one of community joy. James sat back on his bench, his worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea in his hands. Mrs. Thompson joined him, offering a fresh batch of her famous cookies. You know, she said wisely, Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. You didn't just stop some troublemakers that day, you showed us all what community really means. Looking around at the peaceful scene, Thomas playing with his daughter, families enjoying the evening together, young recruits learning about true service, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His training had taught him how to fight, but it had also taught him something more important: how to bring peace. As the movie began to play and stars appeared in the darkening sky, James realized that Liberty Park had become more than just a place to read on Sunday afternoons. It had become a symbol of how one person's courage could inspire an entire community to stand together, proving that the greatest victories aren't won through force, but through understanding, forgiveness, and unity.